Margaret Thompson had always been proud of her son, David. At 60 years old, she had worked 2 jobs to put him through college, sacrificed her own dreams to ensure he had every opportunity she never had. Now 35, David was a successful marketing executive at a prestigious firm downtown. He lived in a fancy apartment, drove an expensive car, and wore suits that cost more than Margaret's monthly pension. But success had changed David in ways Margaret never expected. The humble, grateful boy she had raised had become someone she barely recognized. He seemed embarrassed by his modest upbringing, by the small house where he grew up, and increasingly, by Margaret herself. The first signs appeared during family gatherings. David would check his phone constantly when Margaret spoke, roll his eyes at her stories, and make subtle comments about her outdated views on life. When she mentioned her job at the local grocery store where she worked part-time to supplement her pension, David would quickly change the subject. Margaret noticed how her son's attitude shifted when his colleagues were around. During a company barbecue she attended as his guest, David barely acknowledged her presence. When his boss asked about his family, David gave vague answers and steered the conversation toward work. Margaret felt invisible, like an unwanted reminder of a past he wanted to forget. The breaking point came on a busy Saturday afternoon at the downtown shopping mall. Margaret had been looking forward to spending time with David, something they rarely did anymore. She had dressed in her best clothes, a simple but clean outfit from a discount store. Her gray hair was neatly styled, and she wore the pearl earrings David had given her for her birthday years ago. They were walking through the crowded food court when David spotted a group of his work friends at a nearby table. His entire demeanor changed instantly. The relaxed expression on his face tightened, and Margaret could see him calculating something in his mind. She had learned to read these signs over the past few years. "David," called out his colleague James, waving them over. "Come join us." Margaret smiled warmly, ready to meet more of David's friends. She had always enjoyed meeting new people and hearing about David's work life, but as they approached the table, she noticed David hanging back slightly, creating distance between them. The group welcomed David enthusiastically, but their eyes lingered on Margaret with barely concealed curiosity. She could feel their assessment, taking in her modest appearance, her department store clothes, her working-class accent that David had long since polished away. "So this must be your mother," said Sarah, one of David's female colleagues, with a polite but distant smile. David's jaw tightened. Margaret could see something building in him, a storm she had witnessed gathering for months. The shame he felt, the embarrassment that had been eating away at him, was about to explode in the worst possible way. What happened next would change their relationship forever, and set in motion a chain of events that would teach David a lesson he would never forget. David's face flushed red as his colleagues waited for an introduction. Margaret stepped forward with her usual warm smile, extending her hand to Sarah. "Yes, I'm Margaret. It's so wonderful to finally meet David's work family. He talks about you all so much." But before anyone could respond, David's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Actually, she's not really. This is just Margaret. She used to work for our family when I was younger." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She felt the blood drain from her face as the meaning sank in. Her own son had just denied her, pretended she was hired help instead of the mother, who had given him everything. The table fell silent. Even David's colleagues seemed uncomfortable with the obvious lie. Margaret's hand, still extended toward Sarah, began to tremble slightly. She looked at David with eyes full of hurt and disbelief, searching his face for any sign that this was some kind of mistake. "Oh," Sarah said awkwardly, clearly sensing the tension. "Well, it's nice to meet you, Margaret," David continued, his voice growing louder as if volume could make his lies more convincing. "Yeah, Margaret here is just, she gets a bit confused. Sometimes. Thinks she's family, you know? It's actually kind of sad. I keep her around out of pity, really. She doesn't have much else going on in her life." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she remained standing there, frozen in shock. The other people in the food court were beginning to stare. David's voice had carried, and nearby tables were turning to watch the scene unfold. James shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "David, maybe we should—" But David was on a roll now, years of suppressed embarrassment pouring out in the cruelest way possible. "I mean, look at her. Still shopping at thrift stores, still living in that tiny house. She never made anything of herself. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I hadn't been held back by people like her." The words kept coming, each one designed to hurt more than the last. David talked about Margaret's simple job, her lack of education, her embarrassing habits. He painted a picture of a pathetic woman clinging to someone else's success, too delusional to see her own failures. Margaret stood there taking it all, her heart breaking with each word. The other shoppers were openly staring now. Some looked angry at David's cruelty. Others seemed embarrassed to witness such a public humiliation. A few teenagers at a nearby table were even recording with their phones. Finally, David seemed to run out of steam. The food court fell quiet, except for the distant sounds of kitchen equipment and soft conversations from tables far away. Margaret's tears had stopped flowing, but her face was pale and her hands were shaking. She looked at her son, this man she had raised with such love and sacrifice, and something fundamental shifted inside her. The hurt was still there, but it was being joined by something else, something colder and more determined. "I see," Margaret said quietly, her voice steady despite everything. "Thank you for making that so clear, David." She turned and walked away without another word, leaving David standing there with his colleagues who were now looking at him with a mixture of disgust and discomfort. The damage was done, but Margaret's revenge had not even begun. Margaret drove home in silence, her mind racing despite the calm exterior she maintained. The 20-minute drive gave her time to process what had just happened and, more importantly, to begin planning what would happen next. Once home, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and opened her laptop. David didn't know about many things in his mother's life. He had been so busy climbing his corporate ladder and distancing himself from his roots that he had missed some crucial developments in Margaret's world. What David didn't realize was that his mother had been quietly building her own success story. 3 years ago, Margaret had started a small online business selling handmade crafts and vintage items she found at estate sales. What began as a hobby to fill her retirement hours had grown into something much more substantial. Her little business, Maggie's Treasures, had gained a loyal following on social media. Margaret had a natural eye for valuable vintage pieces and a talent for restoration. Her YouTube channel, where she showed the process of bringing old items back to life, had attracted over 50,000 subscribers. Her Instagram account had even more followers who loved her warm personality and inspiring story of starting over after retirement. But Margaret's most significant achievement was something she had kept as a surprise for David. She had been saving money for months to help him with a down payment on a house. The combination of her business profits, careful budgeting, and some wise investments had allowed her to accumulate nearly $40,000. She had planned to surprise him with this gift at his upcoming birthday. Those plans were about to change dramatically. Margaret opened her laptop and began typing. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard as she crafted a social media post that would change everything. She wrote about the day's events, but not in the way David might expect. Instead of playing the victim, Margaret wrote about the experience with grace and wisdom. She talked about the importance of staying true to your values, about how success should never come at the cost of hurting those who love you. She shared her story of working 2 jobs to support her son's education, of the sacrifices she had made, and of the pride she had felt watching him succeed. But she also wrote about disappointment, about watching someone you love become someone you don't recognize. She wrote about the pain of being denied by your own child, but also about the strength that comes from knowing your own worth. The post was heartfelt, dignified, and powerful. Margaret included a photo of herself from David's college graduation, both of them smiling proudly. The contrast between that happy moment and the day's events was stark and moving. Within hours, the post had been shared hundreds of times. Margaret's followers were outraged on her behalf, but they were also inspired by her strength and grace in handling the situation. The comments poured in, filled with support. love, and admiration for a woman who refused to let cruelty diminish her spirit. But this was just the beginning of Margaret's plan. She had something much more significant in mind, something that would teach David about consequences in a way he would never forget. Margaret picked up her phone and began making calls. She contacted several local news outlets, sharing her story and the growing social media response. She reached out to her network of small business owners and community leaders. Most importantly, she called her lawyer to discuss some changes she wanted to make to her will and other legal documents. By the end of the evening, Margaret had set in motion a series of events that would soon make David's public humiliation of her seem like a minor embarrassment compared to what was coming his way. David woke up Monday morning completely unaware that his life was about to change forever. He had managed to push the mall incident to the back of his mind, convincing himself that he had handled an awkward situation the best way he could. His colleagues had seemed uncomfortable afterward, but David assumed they would forget about it soon enough. He was wrong. The first sign that something was amiss came when David arrived at his office. His assistant Jennifer gave him an odd look as he passed her desk. "David, your mother called this morning. She said to tell you that you might want to check social media today." David frowned, irritated. He had hoped Margaret would just let the whole thing blow over. The last thing he needed was his mother causing drama at his workplace. As the morning progressed, David noticed more strange looks from his colleagues. Conversations seemed to stop when he entered the break room. People, who usually greeted him warmly, were giving him a wide berth. Finally, during his lunch break, David decided to investigate. He opened his phone and checked Facebook, then Instagram, then Twitter. What he found made his blood run cold. Margaret's post about their encounter had exploded across social media. It had been shared thousands of times, with comments ranging from supportive messages for Margaret to harsh criticism of David's behavior. But worse than the general social media attention was who had been sharing it. David recognized names from his professional network, people from his neighborhood, even some of his high school friends. The story was spreading through every circle of his life like wildfire. Local news outlets had picked up the story. "Son denies mother in public mall scene," read one headline. "Viral video shows man's cruel treatment of elderly mother," read another. David realized with growing horror that someone had indeed been recording at the mall, and that footage was now making the rounds online. But the worst was yet to come. As David scrolled through his notifications, he found a message that made his stomach drop. It was from his company's HR department asking him to come in for a meeting that afternoon. The HR meeting was even worse than David had feared. His supervisor, Mr. Patterson, sat across from him with a grim expression. "David, I'm sure you're aware of the situation that's developed over the weekend." "It's all been blown out of proportion," David said quickly. "It was just a misunderstanding." Mr. Patterson pulled up something on his tablet and turned it toward David. It was the company's social media pages, flooded with comments from angry customers threatening to boycott the business if they continued to employ someone who would treat his elderly mother so cruelly. "David, we've built our brand on family values and community respect," Mr. Patterson continued. "This situation is incompatible with our company image. We're going to need you to take some time off while we figure out how to handle this." David felt the room spinning. "You're suspending me? Over something that happened in my personal life?" "We're giving you time to address the situation. If you can find a way to make this right, we can discuss your return. But as it stands now, your presence here is damaging our reputation." Walking out of the office building that afternoon, David felt like he was in a nightmare. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications, most of them negative. Friends were distancing themselves. His reputation was in ruins. And now his job was in jeopardy. But Margaret wasn't done yet. That evening, David received a certified letter that would deliver the final blow to his arrogance. Inside was a letter from his mother's lawyer, along with some very surprising documents that would show David exactly how much he had underestimated the woman he had so cruelly dismissed. David's hands shook as he opened the certified letter. The law firm's letterhead was impressive, not some small-town practice but a prestigious firm downtown. As he read, his eyes widened with each paragraph. The letter began formally, informing David that Margaret Thompson had made significant changes to her estate planning. But as David read further, he discovered shocking truths about his mother's financial situation that she had kept private. Margaret's small business had been far more successful than David ever knew. The letter detailed assets worth over $200,000, including her home, which had appreciated significantly, her business inventory and equipment, several investment accounts, and a life insurance policy with David as the original beneficiary. The key word was original. The letter explained that Margaret had removed David from her will entirely. The house he had grown up in, the business she had built, her savings, her investments. Everything would now go to local charities that supported single mothers trying to get their education, and to a scholarship fund for underprivileged students. But the most devastating part was the final paragraph. Margaret had included a personal message. I spent 35 years investing in my son, believing that love and sacrifice would help him become a good man. Today I learned that my investment failed. I choose to redirect my resources toward people who might use them to actually make the world better. David sank into his couch, the papers scattered around him. In the span of a few days, he had lost his mother's love, his job security, his reputation, and his inheritance. But Margaret had saved the most humiliating revelation for last. The next morning, David woke to find news vans parked outside his apartment building. The story had been picked up by national media. Margaret had given an interview to a prominent morning show, appearing via video call from her modest kitchen. David watched in horror as his mother, calm and dignified, told her story to millions of viewers. She spoke about working multiple jobs to support David's education, about the pride she had felt in his accomplishments, and about the heartbreak of being denied by her own son. But Margaret did something that David hadn't expected. She also talked about forgiveness and second chances. She explained that her actions weren't about revenge, but about setting boundaries and teaching consequences. I hope my son learns from this experience, Margaret said to the host. Success means nothing if it comes at the cost of your humanity. I still love David, but love doesn't mean accepting cruel behavior. The interviewer asked about David's future. Margaret's response was measured but clear. The door to reconciliation is always open, but it requires genuine change, not just apologies. Actions have consequences, and David is learning that now. As David watched, he saw something he had been blind to for years. His mother wasn't the simple, uneducated woman he had painted her as. She was articulate, thoughtful, and strong. She had built a successful business, commanded respect from her community, and handled this crisis with more grace than he had ever shown in his professional life. The interview went viral within hours. On Maggie's Revenge began trending on Twitter, but the posts weren't celebrating cruelty. Instead, people were praising Margaret's dignity and discussing the importance of treating elderly parents with respect. David's phone rang constantly. Some calls were from reporters wanting his side of the story. Others were from friends and relatives expressing their disappointment. But the call that hurt most came from his elderly aunt, Margaret's sister. David, she said, her voice cold with disappointment. I watched the interview this morning. I need you to know that what you did was unforgivable. Margaret raised you better than that, and frankly, I'm ashamed to be related to you right now. As David hung up, he realized that Margaret's revenge was complete. She had exposed his cruelty to the world, shown him the consequences of his actions, and demonstrated that success built on shame and denial was ultimately worthless. 2 weeks after the interview aired, David sat in his empty apartment surrounded by the wreckage of his former life. His company had officially terminated his employment, citing conduct incompatible with company values. Several other job interviews had fallen through once potential employers recognized his name. His landlord had received complaints from other tenants about the media attention, and David was facing possible eviction. The financial reality was setting in. Without his high-paying job and with his reputation in ruins, David was burning through his savings quickly. The expensive lifestyle he had built to distance himself from his humble beginnings was becoming impossible to maintain. But the hardest part wasn't the financial consequences or even the public humiliation. It was the silence from Margaret. She hadn't tried to contact him since the mall incident, and David found himself missing his mother in ways he hadn't expected. For the first time in years, David began to truly reflect on his behavior. He thought about all the times Margaret had called just to check on him, how she had remembered every important date in his life, the way her face lit up when he achieved something new. He remembered the sacrifices she had made, working double shifts so he could have school clothes, saving for months to buy him a computer for college. The man in the mirror looked like a stranger to David now. When had he become someone who could hurt the person who loved him most? When had success become more important than decency? David made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. He drove to Margaret's house, the small home where he had grown up and which he had learned to see as embarrassing. Now, looking at the neat garden and freshly painted fence, he saw something different. He saw home. Margaret answered the door with a neutral expression. She didn't slam it in his face, but she didn't invite him in either. "Hello, David." "Mom," he said, the word feeling strange after years of calling her Margaret in public. "I need to talk to you." "I'm listening." Standing on his childhood doorstep, David began the hardest conversation of his life. He didn't make excuses or try to minimize what he had done. Instead, he talked about his shame, his misguided priorities, and the fear of being seen as less successful that had driven him to deny the most important person in his life. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, tears streaming down his face. "I just need you to know that I'm sorry and that I finally understand what I lost. Not just the inheritance or your support, but the chance to be the son you deserved." Margaret listened quietly, her expression unreadable. When David finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "David," she finally said, "I never wanted revenge. I wanted you to understand consequences. I wanted you to see that the person you had become wasn't the person I raised." She stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in. We have a lot to talk about." Over the next several hours, mother and son had the most honest conversation they had shared in years. Margaret explained that her actions weren't about punishing David, but about forcing him to confront the man he had become. She talked about her business, her success, and her pride in building something meaningful with her own hands. David learned that his mother had always planned to help him buy a house, that she had been saving for months to surprise him. He learned about her YouTube channel, her community involvement, and the respect she had earned through kindness rather than status. "The money isn't really the point," Margaret said. "I can change my will back tomorrow if I choose to. But I needed you to understand that your worth isn't measured by how much you can distance yourself from where you came from." David spent the next months rebuilding his life from the ground up. He took a job at a local nonprofit, earning a fraction of his former salary but finding satisfaction in work that actually helped people. He moved back to his old neighborhood, closer to Margaret, and began repairing relationships he had damaged in his climb toward success. Most importantly, he learned to be proud of his mother publicly. When he finally found a new job in marketing, David made sure his colleagues knew about Margaret's business success, her community work, and her strength in raising a son alone. Margaret eventually did change her will back, but only after seeing genuine, lasting change in David's character. Their relationship was never quite the same as it had been before, but it was built on a foundation of mutual respect and honesty that made it stronger than before. The viral story that had once threatened to destroy David's life became a powerful lesson about the importance of staying true to your values no matter how successful you become. And Margaret's revenge, which had seemed so devastating, turned out to be the greatest gift she could have given her son. The chance to become the man she had always believed he could be.